At last, a voice for the people who pay big government's bills, not the people who make big government's bills. You are listening to Speaking of Taxpayers, sponsored by the 362,000-member National Taxpayers Union. I'm your co-host, Pete Sepp.
And I'm your co-host, Doug Kellogg.
Welcome to this week's broadcast.
Welcome back. We're going to have a very special guest in just a moment, Wes Berry, who's a small business owner out in Michigan, and we're talking Marketplace Fairness Act again. But first, welcome back from the long break, Pete. Congress is getting going a little slowly. They're back in session, though. Our very own Brandon Arnold was actually just testifying at a hearing yesterday to the House Government Oversight Committee, and you can check that out on the website, on the blog. So aside from getting wasteful spending under control, what are some of the taxpayer issues we're going to see as Congress gets going?
Yeah, not necessarily a happy New Year start from a fiscal policy standpoint. We just got done with a bipartisan budget agreement that suspended for 2 years the spending caps that Congress agreed to just in 2011. Not very encouraging. Well, they still have to reconcile some of the figures, the levels of spending that were agreed on in that bill with appropriations, and that requires crafting an omnibus package probably by the middle of this month, unless they start doing what are called more continuing resolutions. We also have votes coming up in late February or early March on extending the debt ceiling. We are still borrowing far too much in this country. By we, I mean our United States Congress and the President of the United States, who is giving his blessing to that borrowing. So that is going to be an important fight. Taxpayers will have to take a stand for greater spending restraint if we're going to avoid having these debt ceiling increases year after year or even several times a year. We are also going to see a very tough tax filing season, I believe. The surtaxes associated with Obamacare on upper income earners took effect last year, but they're not going to show up until people start filing their tax returns this year before April 15th. I think that small businesses will be in an especially big bind with these taxes, trying to cope with them, the ones that use the 1040 tax return to declare their profits and income taxes. I wonder whether some of them adequately planned for these tax hikes in 2013. They may find that they owe a ton of money to the IRS, or they're not getting as big a refund as they had hoped for, and that could show up in major downstream problems like delayed or deferred expansion plans or hiring plans. So we may have some very serious headwinds against a more robust economic recovery in 2014, made all the worse if we get this Marketplace Fairness Act with momentum put into place. That would be terrible. Also, we can't discount what might happen if the minimum wage is increased. That could put pressure on small businesses from another direction. And we are at a crossroads with American energy development. Will Congress and the President lay off this fantastic trend of what's called hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling that's bringing so much energy to the United States consumers that, in fact, we may become an energy exporter very soon by, say, the end of this decade? Those trends could be arrested very quickly if Congress and the President decide to enact punitive taxes on oil and gas companies.
Well, not a particularly sunny forecast from you, Pete, but we also have on top of that an election year, which could also throw a curveball as we get closer and closer to November on exactly what the agenda in Congress is. So definitely stay tuned to ntu.org and the podcast, and we'll try to navigate it as best we can with you. We're back on the podcast after a long but welcome winter break. We hope you had a wonderful Christmas and New Year's. Really appreciate everybody tuning back in. Today, we're very pleased to have Wes Berry of Wesley Berry Flowers in Commerce, Michigan, joining us. We're going to talk about Marketplace Fairness Act, but a quick reminder, we briefly mentioned before Christmas break that the U.S. Supreme Court had passed on the New York Amazon tax case, which was something NTU was keeping an eye on. That's one of the latest developments on this. In the news, you'll see a lot of support lurking for Marketplace Fairness Act, which is really disturbing for taxpayers, and in particular for Wes, who's kind enough to join us today and talk about the impact that this legislation would have on business owners. So welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Well, Wes, could you describe for us the nature of your business and why e-commerce is so central to it?
Well, we own a flower shop, and we've been in business since 1946, and we're located in the metropolitan Detroit area. And, being in the Detroit area, we've weathered more than our share of storms. And one of the things that we've done over the years is we've adapted to being an internet marketer as well as a brick and mortar business. And it's very difficult to operate an internet business, although a lot of people who don't operate one seem to think that it may be a breeze. There are a tremendous amount of competitive pressures and cost issues that are involved. And sometimes I think the only people who make money are the search engines. But at any rate, it's a competitive environment, and throwing on to the till the additional burden of this tax collection for the thousands of different jurisdictions that would be involved would just be overwhelmingly arduous for us. At the same time, we are confused a little bit because it's very difficult to justify somebody in California who's calling us in Michigan or online with us in Michigan to order flowers to go to someone in Washington State or Ontario on how there's a justification that we need to pay remit sales tax to the state of California. And it just becomes very, very, very confusing. Not only from an accounting standpoint, just from a rationale standpoint. I'm not really utilizing any of the resources in the state of California. I'm not driving on their roads. And at the same time, he might not even be in California when he's calling us. We had an order just the other day. It was placed in Korea from a resident of Ontario going to a resident in where were they? I think it was in Florida. So, how is there a justification there? I mean, how can you pin where it belongs in a reasonable way? Very, very difficult.
Yeah, I would imagine so. And you bring up an excellent point here. This is not necessarily just a state-to-state commerce issue. This could be international in its implications. Being in the Detroit area, yes, I imagine you very well might have customers from Canada or going to Canada, all kinds of transactions. And it's hard to see how the, first of all, Marketplace Fairness Act law itself could provide any guidance on this, but secondly, the regulations that would implement it. I imagine it would be a horrible tangle, and that kind of brings me to another question here. Do you think really that the claims of folks who support this law that software will somehow magically erase these big questions, will solve all your problems and tell you what to do, is that a valid claim?
Well, I think that it might be, as long as they can get the same people who put together the healthcare website to facilitate that. I'm confident that, in another 5 days and then another 5 days and then in another month, and then sometime into the next millennium, they'll be able to figure it out.
Yeah, that's that's very disturbing. Now,
it just doesn't work that way. When you're in the internet business, like as effectively as we are, minor changes require very sophisticated developments and rollouts and A/B testing and trying to unintended consequences that occur all the time. And we have a routine sales tax audit for the state of Michigan coming up next week, which we go through, as a routine course. And I can't even imagine having to prepare for tax audits, sales tax audits, from 50 or 100 or 200 of the different taxing entities throughout the United States. It's nice to say, oh, the magic of computerization will answer those questions. But it doesn't quite work that way. And even if it does, the sophistication that's involved in being able to execute it is going to be just insane. I'm going to have to write more checks or make more money transfers to sales tax places than I do to everyone else collectively.
Yeah, absolutely. And describe for us just a little bit what a sales tax audit from one state does. I mean, this I imagine involves a great deal of preparation on your part to meet the various filing and compliance requirements.
Well, it's usually that is a matter of course we take care of, and our accountants handle that. And there's probably about 10 accounting hours or 12 accounting hours every month at $200 an hour that just takes care of Michigan's routine sales tax payment. But when you have an audit, you're looking at a minimum of 40 hours of prep and meeting. And then, if they scratch their head and want to see something deeper in one area or another, then they're doing their job. It requires even more expenditure. So, I mean, the whole thing is, I think a lot of people don't understand. Our buddy Freeman wrote a book about the world being flat, and that you can be anywhere and do business on the internet. Between the healthcare and this so-called Marketplace Fairness Act, they're pushing more and more internet businesses to look towards areas like the Philippines. Because there's absolutely listen, every time we do the math, we should relocate our call center and our internet business offshore, but we don't do it. But every time we do the math, there's another piece that gets thrown in there. And whether it was the healthcare or whether it's Marketplace Fairness Act, you can only add 10% to your bill so many times, and it starts to become unreasonable. At this point, it's almost poor business for an internet business to remain in the United States if these sort of taxes and levies are going to be imposed.
Wow, that's a really stunning revelation, and I think you're absolutely right that people don't necessarily understand the pressures that businesses are under right now and the added burdens they would face under MFA and the decisions they might be forced to make. And if indeed the world of e-commerce is something that can easily be picked up and replicated anywhere outside the United States, that could very well be what happens here.
You've got fulfillment centers that you can contract with to distribute the products that you want. There's no sales tax collection issue at all because there's no home state to be tagged. Instead, there's a business who's transferred the order from the Philippines for them to take care of. I mean, all too often, people seem to think that they can operate inside a vacuum, and that if they just say, oh, well, you know what, we're going to charge you an extra 10%, so you'll just have to take that out of your supposed profits. We don't make 10%. It isn't that way. What happens is you give someone an opportunity to say, hey, you know what, if I pick it up and move, I'll have a 10% competitive advantage over everyone else. I'll grab more market share. So, it's a very poorly thought through process.
Yeah, that's an important point, too. What do you think the political establishment was trying to conceive of here when they pushed Marketplace Fairness Act. I mean, where do you believe that members of Congress have been getting input from real life business owners who understand these impacts, or are they just being sort of led around like horses with blinders on by interests who want higher taxes and higher revenues? I mean, how in the world is this bill even having any momentum in Congress right now?
Well, I think you hit it right on the head when you said horses with blinders. Because I'm pretty confident that early in the 1900s, there was probably similar legislation requiring buggy whips be attached to all automobiles. When something no longer works the way they wanted it to work, it was fine before the Internet wasn't around to utilize sales tax as a major revenue source. But when the Internet became a reality, the sales tax, started to become an obsolete type tax, just as obsolete as a buggy whip is. There's a states' rights issue involved as well, and unfortunately, some of the states' rights people have it backwards. It isn't about I should be able to collect sales tax on things that come into my state. It should be that some other state can't come into my state and levy a tax on my citizens and have the right to audit my citizens from another state. This is a very slippery slope, and it's not well reasoned. It's trying to put the genie back in the bottle, and that doesn't work. The reality is that the internet industry is here to stay, and it's not reasonable to expect me in Michigan to collect sales tax for someone in Oregon. By the way, every one of these states has a requirement that its citizens pay sales tax that they're required to pay.
Yes.
But how is a citizen in Oregon required to pay any sales tax on something he buys through an internet business in Michigan for delivery to Florida? So who gets the sales tax?
Yeah.
Michigan, Florida, Oregon. Well, some people think it's where the transaction was made. Does that mean I got to find out where the server was located that the transaction was made on instead? You cannot make 17th century medicine work today in most cases, any more than you can take those same sort of taxing technologies and transportation issues and so on that existed 100 years ago and expect them to apply today. And you cannot just keep trying to force it into a different mold. It's not reasonable. And by the way, the reason why it's not reasonable is there's over 2,000 different sales tax gathering entities in this United States.
Yeah.
So if they make a change in Cook County, Illinois, I got to know about it. And if I don't, I'm subject to a sales tax audit. Well, I'm subject to it anyways. You don't have to do anything wrong to have a sales tax audit. It's just a matter of course. You do a little bit of business. It's your turn. It might not happen every year, but maybe every 5 or 10 years you get a sales tax audit. You're going to have so who's going to fly the people from California to Michigan to do the sales tax audit, or do I have to go there? It's insane.
Yeah, and these kinds of situations, I imagine, would be a problem especially for small businesses because, if you were forced to go fly to California to try and comply with this thing, well, that's time out of your business, which feeds into the profitability loop, which feeds into the employability loop, which feeds into the viability loop, and sooner or later, you're spending so much time on compliance, you no longer have a business left.
Exactly. And when you take some businesses, and I don't want to pick on anybody, but say we're talking about somebody like Amazon, they already have physical locations all over the country. As a result of having that physical footprint and the presence all over the country, they're obligated to those local sales taxes. So that doesn't make any difference to them. We're talking about if you have a physical presence in Cook County, then we're responsible to collect and pay those sales taxes that are applicable in Cook County to residents who make purchases there. But now, if you have an internet business in Cook County with a different county sales tax and somebody from a different county but is in Illinois places an order with you, you have to determine whether or not whether they're liable for the Cook County sales tax. I mean, it just goes on and on. It'd be easier to figure out a coup to overthrow the Lord Almighty in heaven than it would be to figure out how to do this.
Well, I think that's where we start to get into the disturbing next steps, which is one reason we have to defeat this bill, and why the erosion of the constitutional protections that NTU is fighting to keep in place is so big, is that it removes any legal process for citizens, it removes those barriers between states, and it makes it hard to see exactly where the reach of government will end and allow people to act. And like you said, it makes going overseas seem very reasonable.
And we don't want to do that. We really, really, right now the math already says we should. Why do you think when you call so many places, they answer the phone in the Philippines or they answer it in India? The reality of it is that for an internet business, they're surrounded. An internet business is based around their call center. So if you want internet businesses to gravitate towards where their call centers are even more than they already are, that's where they're going to go. And as far as fulfillment, you may have to pay some sales tax. I don't know how you would have to pay any sales tax on it if you were offshore shipping into the United States. As long as you're shipping things that are legal, who do you owe the sales tax to? So let's say you're shipping books. So you ship the books from Mexico, and you have your call center in let's say the Philippines. So it is not a vacuum. People will react when you do things. When you raise a cost on something, they look for ways to reduce costs or absorb those costs or reposition themselves so that they're not obligated to those costs. And ours is we're a pretty hefty part of our business is internet, but we've got about 100 people that are engaged in this process. And I can't honestly tell you that it would make any sense for those 100 citizens in Michigan to have jobs if this goes through, combined with the health care issues. It just gets too burdensome.
Really
I know it'll be wrong for me to stay. We may stay, but it'll be wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really unfortunate that that's the direction it's going. But, we're here to fight back. And I think it's interesting that at some point there will be a split even among left-leaning politicians who tend to be more interested in taxes. We see Governor Cuomo having to give some ground on possibly reducing New York tax rates. And it's interesting that you see that, and then you may see other politicians still push for more barriers to companies moving around or possibly exiting the country. So this debate will continue.
And it gets even more confusing. There are states that don't have sales tax. So here's a guy, I believe, I'm not sure, I could be wrong, but I think Alaska doesn't have a sales tax. Does that sound right to you, or? Just for the sake of argument,
no statewide sales tax.
Yeah, okay. Some state that doesn't have sales tax, or some jurisdiction that doesn't have sales tax. Now all of a sudden, a business located there is required to collect sales tax for what purpose? What benefit is he receiving to collect the sales tax? And somehow people think, well, collecting sales tax, that's not really your money as a business that you're giving to the government. You're taking it from someone else. Listen, when you add it on the bill and someone pays it to you, if you didn't add the sales tax on the bill, maybe you could add something else on the bill. But you're the one who collected the money. And by the way, even if I don't collect the money, I'm obligated to pay it. So if I don't collect the sales tax from somebody, and I'm obligated to pay sales tax someplace, I got to pay it whether I collect it or not. Trust me, it's coming out of my pocket, one way or the other.
Yeah. Yeah. And one final question. Do you think that the portrayals of unanimity in the small business community over supporting the Marketplace Fairness Act are at all based in reality? I mean, are there colleagues, either in your own line of business or in other businesses, who feel the way you do? I mean, is this a widespread or growing concern now?
Well, some we got to be realistic about it. Obviously, some brick and mortar businesses don't like the idea that someone can make a purchase without paying the sales tax. But when they make that purchase without paying the sales tax, they got to pay shipping charges. They got to pay other charges that are associated with it. And I have 5 brick and mortar businesses here that sell flowers in the metropolitan Detroit area. And they're important to me. They've been in my family for over 60, almost 70, going on 70 years. But the reality is that people who come into my brick and mortar shops to buy something are not the same people who go to my internet businesses to buy something. If you're driving home and you want to stop and pick up a book, that's one thing. If you're at home and you want to order books for school, it's sort of a little bit different environment. And regardless to whether or not they embrace it or not, the internet is not going to go away. And you can make they can make whatever kind of analysis they want. They have to adapt, and they have to utilize their own skills to be competitive and to remain competitive. And my brick and mortar shops remain competitive. That's something that people have to do on their own. But it's not. The internet's not going to go away. And this game about the sales tax thing is only going to push more businesses offshore.
Wow. Very interesting revelations, and thank you so much, Wes, for sharing your observations with us and with our listeners. Very enlightening, and we appreciate your taking the time to join us today.
Thank you for having me.
All right.
It's time for the outrage of the week. And this week we're checking out some of the year-end use it or lose it expenses we see in Washington as federal agencies try to make use of their budget before the new year is out. And the Washington Post has the story. Definitely check it out. David A. Farrenholt is the reporter. The Department of Veterans Affairs amongst the highlights bought $562,000 worth of artwork. Important final end of the year expenses.
Wow.
The Agricultural Department, $144,000 on toner cartridges. Although, sometimes it feels like all our offices have to spend that much on toner cartridges. The Coast Guard spent $178,000 on cubicle furniture rehab, which might be the final highlight worth mentioning. But there are expenses like this all across the board, Pete, and you've seen it year after year in D.C. I'm glad the agencies can get some early Christmas presents, but it really costs taxpayers.
Yeah, it is an annual ritual motivated by some kind of fear that, well, if we don't spend it all, we'll look like we don't need that much next year, so let's just push the money out the door and see where it lands. Well, here are the places where it lands, and unfortunately, taxpayers are the one footing the bill. I would think that Congress, and there have been reforms proposed in this area, could very easily rectify the situation by saying something like, well, if you have money left over at the end of the year that you didn't spend, we're not going to hold it against you at budgeting time, or we're going to allow you to reward your employees with bonuses for having saved money. Hey, there's an idea. I know there are already similar systems set up in the federal government to encourage employees to come forward and recommend savings. The president himself actually began such a program, and it's been somewhat of a success. Why not expand it? And here's a way to do it.
And these agencies always seem to go to Congress and ask for more money, because if we don't let our budget keep growing, then all these wonderful projects will be lost to us, and our education numbers will go down and things like that. And these things need to be brought up at times like that. If you all need money, why don't you try helping us save it when you're buying artwork or repairing your cubicle furniture? That is where you should be saving money rather than constantly asking to increase your budget.
Well, yes, and some of these things do have shelf lives, even toner. Certain forms of it you're supposed to use in a certain period of time or it starts to degrade. So I think a great follow-up story would be in seeing whether the agriculture department actually consumes this stuff or whether it just sits in a warehouse somewhere and never gets used up ever. Well, folks, it may be the beginning of the year, but it's the end of the year that we often have to watch out for when it comes to spending taxpayer dollars, and that's why this is the Outrage of the Week. That about does it for this edition of Speaking of Taxpayers. Remember, folks, you have the power to fight the power if you speak truth to power, and we speak truth to power every week here on Speaking of Taxpayers. I'm your co-host, Pete Sepp.
And I'm your co-host, Doug Kellogg.
So long.